Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I spoke with Nathan Dolans, who is an assistant professor in Louisiana, works in the education department there. And you'll hear him talk about his background and describe his work in the beginning parts of the podcast. So I won't belabor that here. I will say this is a much longer than normal podcast because we got into the weeds and I thought had some really good and I thought fun conversation as we unpacked his critique of the next generation science standards. He has 5 major points, and some of that certainly revolves around inquiry. Some things I really agreed with and some things I disagreed with, and we found some interesting conversation to be had about that and went a little bit longer than what I anticipated. So hopefully you get to the end of this and find it useful. I would like to remind you that some of those things that we talk about, we do work with schools on in the professional development realm, and you can find that at wegrowteachers.com. I'll also mention we have 2 upcoming events that are focused on knowledge-rich inquiry. One is for teachers primarily, and that is in October, an in-person event here in Louisville, Kentucky. That is Inquiry Grow 26. And the other is focused more on instructional leadership and thinking more deeply about how to help your teachers and educators in your buildings and districts with knowledge-rich inquiry. That instructional leadership immersive will be 9 weeks and starting in September. You can find both of those on wegrowteachers.com. It'll be along the top and in various places on the website as well. And you can always email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org about this, that, or any other concerns and questions that you might have. And now here is my conversation with Nathan. I am with Nathan Dolans, and we're going to talk about his PDF and critique of the next generation science standards. Keep saying national. Good intentions, bad implementation, critiquing the next generation science standards and providing suggestions for moving forward. As always, I want to welcome him, but also give him an opportunity to introduce himself, other than the fact that he is a professor, associate professor at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. So go ahead and introduce yourself and give the folks a little background.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm a former high school science teacher in the Chicago Public Schools. That was teaching there back in before the next generation science standards came out back in 2008. So I taught biology and earth science. And then the last year I was teaching there, I created a physics class because the high school I was at didn't have physics. Thought I was going to teach forever. I love teaching, but I met a professor at the University of Virginia who convinced me to join his research group, get a PhD, and then I was recruited to move down here to Lafayette to be a professor of science education. So I've been down here. I'm going into my 11th year. Our semester just started this week. It's always a great time at the beginning of the semester. So, but as far as getting into critiquing the next generation science standards, I just want to start off by saying I was a huge proponent of them when they came out. And because I understood their intentions of having a more active science classroom.
Okay, so you're teaching now at the university level in, I assume, the science department. What courses are you teaching?
So I'm actually in the College of Education.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm working with future teachers on how to teach science. And so teaching the elementary group and then a secondary group. So future teachers and all grade levels.
Like my daughter.
Yeah. And even taking on an early childhood, having a little bit more of a play exploration approach that for the early childhood group too. So again, working with all levels of how to teach science.
And you were a high school teacher. Where, or I guess maybe more interestingly, but feel free to say where. How would you characterize your teaching, your pre-service, that training to be a teacher, and what was that path like?
So I went through a program at Northwestern University through an alt-cert program. And the format that they had was, you had a summer, it was 10 weeks. It was student teaching in the morning and then classwork in the afternoon. While we were doing student teaching that summer, we had to look for a job. I was fortunate to land a job at a high school called Prosser Career Academy. I loved teaching there. I more or less because there was a lot of autonomy. Plus, I was working with some other great teachers. And I don't think the teacher prep was that helpful, but it was more of my background in biological sciences that helped me, flourish. I would say I was above average teacher. I actually am thinking now of even taking a sabbatical and going back into the classroom for a year because I do keep close contact with a lot of schools, and so I am in the classroom still. But I have been thinking about, I'm talking the talk, but can I actually walk the walk? And so I've been thinking about, going back into the classroom, not full time, but just, going back for maybe a year.
Yeah. Well, that would be an interesting transition. How would you characterize your sort of K-12 experience? What was that like?
You mean more on the elementary side?
Well, as a student growing up.
Oh, yeah.
Would you say it was more traditional, a little bit more?
Sure. I had a great mix. I had a fortunate to have both public and private education. It was a mix. I actually started in a Catholic school, and then my parents changed me to a public school because of this local Catholic school. They were worried about the math education there, so they switched me over to a public school. And then I always had great science teachers, just fortunate throughout K-12 education. When I got into high school, I went to a Catholic all-boys high school, and I had some phenomenal teachers. My chemistry teacher, my physics teacher, even my biology teacher were all fantastic. And that played a big role on how I look at science. And again, there's some, when I look at these standards, again, I understand their intentions. It's just that, and we'll get into this, like the design of them and what it's played out, it's not matching what they're originally intending.
So, and before we get there,
Sure.
maybe one last question about that experience. So when you say they were great, you had, cited some great science teachers. What would you say were the things that made them great? What were their distinguishing features or characteristics?
Sure. Well, they had a great balance between what we want out of science classrooms, which is you're doing science, you have these investigations, you have these experiments, but you're also getting a rigorous education, meaning you're studying the content. And they did a great job of connecting the two. I can remember my freshman year of high school, I had a biology class, and that teacher, she was amazing in terms of, like, she was so into plants, botany. We had almost the first semester was all about plant structure, growing different types of plants, understanding the anatomy. But I remember spending so much time in the lab part of the classroom, growing plants, studying the anatomy, drawing out things, and then also spending time doing concept maps and understanding how studying the plants and the investigation that we're doing, how that related to other species. Again, time and time again, these teachers that I had, again, super fortunate to have this. they had a great balance between the investigations, the experiments, and the actual content. They never deviated from the content, which is, is what you want.
Right. Okay. So you've got several issues to take with NGSS.
Sure.
And I was not a science teacher. I was a social studies teacher, but as anybody who listens to this podcast with any regularity knows, I'm a big fan of inquiry. Science obviously is very heavy on inquiry, but we also, and I always emphasize, the importance of knowledge. So some of the questions that I will have might be in devil's advocacy, others might not be, but
Sure.
We'll leave to listeners to figure some of those things out. So the issues, table of contents, the omission of sciences, guiding principles, the conflation of science and engineering, fragmentation of science practices, reliance on thematic lenses that undermine deep content mastery, vague descriptions, and disordered sequencing of science content.
Yeah.
And I guess, so what are let's start, maybe not exactly steel manning, but a little bit of steel manning. Like, what are the best parts about NGSS? What do you like about them most? Besides the intentions.
What's the best parts about them? They are, the best parts about them is that they again, it's hard to move beyond the intentions because the way that they're designed doesn't help develop dynamic science teachers. So beyond their intentions, I don't have a lot of great things to say other than they are showing practices. So the doing part of science, so they do present them. So that's a good thing, right? And I know that there's these intentions of these, what we call these cross-cutting concepts, which are themes.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that they are, even incorporating some engineering, those are some positive things. But the way they went about these in terms of their overall design is not played out, especially in a lot of new curricula that we're seeing. It's not leading to what we really want out of science classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And, yeah.
So the first part of the paper talks about previous critiques of the NGSS,
Right.
And I noticed the National Association of Scholars report. And, I talked in 2024 with, I don't know if you're familiar with Randy Wayne, he's a Cornell professor, and he and I talked about the Franklin standards.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And of course, at least to my knowledge, Franklin standards hadn't really gained much traction. His complaint was, if I'm characterizing it and remembering it correctly, was that students are coming to Cornell, for example, into his classes and lacking lots of knowledge, a lot of baseline foundational conceptual knowledge. And part of the reason, he said, which isn't, I don't think, your assertion, or at least not a big part of it, is that there was a sort of social justice angle to the NGSS that was affecting that. I quibbled with that in that conversation. We talked about that, but maybe if you don't mind sort of unpacking just fairly quickly, what are those sort of, how would you characterize those previous critiques before we get to your specific ones?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm not the first person, as you just pointed out, to critique these standards. I'm not going to be the last one. These previous critiques have pointed out that, first of all, there is a lot of core foundational content that is missing. That is, especially in physics, especially in chemistry. There's hardly any mathematics involved that's listed. The argument for that is, oh, well, these are just an outline. But we can get into that. I have a counter argument to that. So that's a big thing. There's a lot of missing content. And both, when these first came out, the two documents I reference is one's the Fordham Institute, which came out and did a report or critique of them in 2013. And then again, the National Association of Scholars in 2021. The other critiques have to do with, they set these what are called assessment boundaries, and every standard has these assessment boundaries, and on one side there's an argument where, well, you only need to cover certain things. Okay, but on the other side of the coin, the same coin is, well, why would you ever set limitations on what you should and should not cover? And if you're setting assessment boundaries, you're limiting what you're setting a ceiling for students. And so in other words, you're setting a low bar, when in fact we have a lot of students across this country that need to be challenged in a more advanced way. So that's another thing. As far as the integration of engineering, this actually, what we see is that we're starting to see different, science teachers use engineering as a way of teaching science, and there's problems with that. So in addition, like, they're teaching engineering without science, and that leads to what we call engineering appreciation. You're not really getting into the rigorous, engineering endeavor, which requires you to understand the content, the mathematics, the physics. And so that's another issue that they bring up. Overall, they prioritize the doing of science rather than the actual learning of content.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is certainly came through in some of the specific critiques and issues that we'll get into, no doubt. So you in the piece or the paper, you talk about what is science and a myopic view of science, and trying to, I think, level set or at least redefine, or I guess maybe it's accurate to say that you feel like NGS has sort of redefined it in a way that isn't the way that you're not very comfortable with. Maybe you can talk about how you see science and how you would define science, but also, and I asked this as a devil's advocacy question. I just had a conversation with somebody about math teaching, and I asked, like, so why is math especially high level math, so important? Science is somewhat similar there's a lot of facts and a lot of things that many of us as adults don't use. I'm not saying that it's not important, but I'm curious, how do you see that? There are certainly some people with math or science or whatever domain expertise is important because they're going to go into a STEM field or something like that, but many of us aren't. So why is it so important that we have this content knowledge?
Well, okay, so you have two questions here.
At least.
At least two questions. One about, like, how do I look at science, and then why content is so important.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, what the next generation science standards have led to they've cultivated a science education where science teachers, science coordinators, science ed academics, they're unable to define what science is. And science is actually quite simple. It's a body of knowledge, right? This is your biology, your chemistry. This is the content that we want our students to learn. But this body of knowledge can change. And in order for it to change, we also look at science as a set of methods, and like the doing part of science. And I would argue over the last 10 plus years, we're defining science in this way, and only in this way. If you've been teaching science for a while, like around 2010, we weren't defining science in this doing part. We were focusing more on the body of knowledge. But there's a third way of looking at science, and it's really based off of this question. I mean, have you ever done an experiment and it didn't work?
Probably, I don't remember last time I did a science experiment, but
Well,
just
any
in general,
experiment.
right? Yeah.
Right. Well, exactly. Like we all make mistakes. It could have been the question that you asked was wrong, or maybe the way
Right.
that you collected data, or maybe the way you interpreted it was off.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to have a set of guardrails. So that we have another way of looking at science is a set of principles. And there are science educators that study these. They're called the nature of science. And there are these 8 principles. And unfortunately, these principles are not one of the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards. They've been tucked away in an appendix. And I mean, that leads to a really important question. What is science, or even science education, without a set of principles?
Hmm.
And so those principles, they add direction and validity to this overall process. And it's the scientific process. People call it a variety of things. You're using this term inquiry. That's what this is.
Mm-hmm.
There is some sort of question. You have some sort of method of gathering data, and then you make meaning out of that. And it's an iterative process. It's a cycle. And this process, as a way of knowing, here's another way of knowing, just so you know what I'm talking about. If you're in elementary education, you've heard of this, the I do, we do, you do approach,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a different way of knowing. I'm not saying it's bad, better or worse. It's just a different way than what science is. And science as a way of knowing is not promoted in the next generation science standards. You compare these 3 parts, interconnected parts of what science is, with the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards, and we immediately see NGSS, they're not science. It's an interpretation of science.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah.
There's some. So again, inquiry, and I'm, as I have said, and everybody who listens to or reads me know, I'm a big fan and proponent and advocate of inquiry, and I see a lot of NGSS pushback on the inquiry pieces, and we'll get into that, I think, when we get into the cognitive load and expertise reversal effect and
Sure.
things like that. That puzzles me, quite honestly, because I think you would agree that inquiry and the sort of scientific method writ large is not owned by science, right? Like, it is empiricism in some ways, right? And this is something that I really think is super important. One of the big reasons why I advocate for inquiry so much is the process by which we figure out what is true and what is not true. Empiricism, and science in the scientific method is a very concrete formulation of that, but it's not only with science per se. I mean, concrete in the terms of like variables and dependent variables and hypothesis. I mean, there's a sort of a process, and feel free to disagree with that. But like the ways in which we figure out what is true, which is something that we're struggling with as a society because everybody has their own truth and all of this. I think that inquiry is such a really valuable tool, and I see a lot of that in the sort of principles that you're mentioning. So,
the methods that I use in my science methods class is like what you're talking about. We really reduce things down. So when you say the word inquiry, and inquiry, the reduced form of the scientific method, those are the same thing. And there's a lot of confusion about this thing called inquiry. And I hear a lot of educators that are not familiar with science education, and they hear this word inquiry and they're almost, they shut it down. And the problem is the next generation science standards doesn't promote inquiry. It actually fragments it. And I talk about this, and this is a hard, they get away from it. and it's fascinating what they've created. So I argue that the next generation science standard doesn't promote inquiry at all. It actually it does it in it's created an artificial matrix. So getting back to what science is, again, it's the inquiry process, the reduced form of the scientific method. Those are one and the same, and that reduced form of the scientific method aligns with everything of how we define what science is. The conclusion of this iterative process is the body of knowledge. The actual method of gathering data, well, that's science as a methodology. And the question, in other words, the curiosity, the skepticism, the critiquing, the questioning, that starts this process and keeps it going. And that's one of the principles of science. And so all of them are connected. But again, getting back to NGSS, that iterative process is not promoted at all. And so you get a bunch of people that are critiquing science, but they're critiquing, what they're really critiquing is what's come out of NGSS and not really what science is.
Well, so, and we're going to get into it, I think, when we get to the novice and expert pieces that you've got in here.
Sure.
But again, I find there in all of this sort of discussion is that there's some weird puzzling tensions to me about the role of inquiry and why inquiry is important, and how that relates to novices and experts.
Sure.
You know, again, I'm looking at I think the set of principles, and if I'm counting them up right, there's probably 8 here: relying on evidence-based observable data, tentativeness, addressing testable questions, recognition as a human endeavor prone to bias but striving for objectivity. Sure. And I talk about one of the principles that or concepts that I've tried to develop in civic spaces, objective pluralism, is that we do have an objective set of knowledge that we've figured out based on empiricism. And I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge, but you know that there's some commitments and things that go with that that I think most people don't understand and don't haven't onboarded or have lost sight of. But there's a pluralism, and it's important to continue for the revision, right? To entertain the different perspectives, but to understand differences between perspectives and what we believe is what is knowledge, sure. Right? So iterative process, knowledge builds sequentially and that kind of thing. So one of the things I highlighted, and I just made a note to ask you to sort of unpack and explain, is on the most basic level, NGSS are not science, they are merely an interpretation of science. So what do you mean by that?
Okay, so I mentioned this a moment ago, again, like at its core, if you're not highlighting the nature of science principles, and I want to say I'm not even a nature science guy, meaning I don't study how they're embedded in science education. But even I know that they're a part of what we refer to as science. If let's say you're not basing science off of evidence, well then what are you basing it off of? All right, this is when we start to get into, you embed engineering into science and you allow that confusion between science and engineering. That's an example. Well, if you don't have something that's tentative, in other words, a recorrective mechanism in science, well, then what are you doing? And this is, for example, in the natural sciences and in engineering and even in business schools, you have those people can present, let's say, an economic model or a scientific study or some sort of engineering, and there's a recorrectiveness embedded within those disciplines. In the social sciences, there isn't that part where there's a corrective piece within it, and so you allow individuals to pontificate and put out these theories where there's no checks and balances. There are There are no principles that we see in the natural sciences or in engineering or even in business. And that leads to a lot of problems. So, and it actually increases human biases. Again, we recognize science as a human endeavor, but we want to reduce bias as much as possible in science. So all of these principles, and I keep talking, I do mention all 8 of these, where time and time again, in all of those 5, in the other 4 issues that I bring up in my article, the 2 through 5, they all stem from this original issue that I bring up in the report, where we're not highlighting these nature of science principles. And so again, all of them are violated over and over and over in these standards and how they're designed. And of course, if you study a lot of new curricula that are out there, a lot of these what are called anchor phenomenon curricula, it's like the developers have never been in a science classroom. It's as if they don't understand what science is. And so that's what I'm talking about when you have these 3 interconnected definitions of science. They don't align with the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards.
So let me see if I'm getting this right, because you mentioned the social science, and so somebody might write a paper that makes some claim. It even could be about biological differences, and we don't need to get into the weeds on things like that. But those conclusions might be used in further discussion, and should be, in my estimation, as a perspective, or in sort of sense of pluralism, to then come to and add to the body of what we believe is accepted knowledge, and that kind of thing. In a classroom, in a K through 12 classroom, they're not doing that, right? They're not generating new knowledge. That's not the role of K-12. It is in university. So how does that show? Is the concern there that that the students are coming to wrong conclusions, perhaps, and walking away with knowledge that is incorrect and not factually based?
It's more of, it's not that they're not learning content, it's that they're learning less content. And it's not in a lot of these new curricula that are out there they position the content around a particular story, or is presented in illogical orders. So if you're a biology teacher, okay, you're teaching content in a logical order, you'll start with the individual unit, which is the cell. Or if you're teaching chemistry, you'll start with an atom, right? Or in physics, you'll start with kinematics. And in each of those disciplines, you'll teach it in a logical order. And in other words, science, the content knowledge is sequential. It doesn't need context to build on itself. Well, imagine a curriculum where you don't teach content in a logical order, and the NGSS allows these types of curricula to be developed. And so you are teaching content in a random order, and you're skipping prerequisite knowledge. And so they develop a patchwork of knowledge with a lot of gaps, but they're not aware that there are gaps. So the individual that you were talking to about Cornell, saying that a lot of incoming freshmen are missing content knowledge. Absolutely, I agree with him, because the standards are missing content, but then the curricula that are out, these new curricula out there, are teaching the content in illogical orders. So naturally, we have a whole generation that doesn't understand how content and concepts are connected. They just have random pieces of information about a phenomenon here and a phenomenon there, but they don't understand how they're connected.
So why are the curricula? Because that was, one of my questions and things that as I was reading, thinking, how much of this can and maybe even should be addressed in the curriculum phase. Why are curriculum creators doing it in a random way? Wouldn't there be a process that would make more sense for them to do it in a more foundationally linear way?
Well, when you go from one standard to the next, in next generation science standard, oftentimes it's hard to connect one standard to the next. And oftentimes you're looking at the content, what they call the disciplinary core idea. So that's the content. And when you're looking at from one to the next, there's oftentimes a disconnect. And there's a gap in content there. And then furthermore, they talk about this in one of their appendices where they say that the appendix, I think it's appendix K in the next generation science standards, where they allow any district or any state to, if they have some sort of mission, they can center these standards, they can rearrange the standards, I should say, sequence the standards in any way they want to. And they allow for that flexibility. So that I bring this up where you're going to have schools that ignore these standards, or they'll put the standards off to the side, and they'll try to either develop a curriculum or use a curriculum that follows a logical order. Like I'm looking at a chemistry book right here that has I know it follows a logical order because you can open up the book and it has a table of contents, right? And you see, okay, there's an order to this. A lot of these new curricula that are out there, they don't have that. And you can tell right away, these are not following a logical order of content. And you really want more order when you get into middle school and high school.
So are there curricula that are following some logical, and are those the HQIR, HQIM designated ones, or?
Well, remember who's determining what is a high quality instructional material, right? And then so you have the individuals that are supporting these illogical science curricula are also determining what is high quality and what is not high quality. So I have talking to teachers over the last 5 years, and I've spoken with hundreds of them, not just here in Louisiana, but around the country. Time and time again, I keep hearing from teachers, there is yet to be a solid curriculum that has come out of the next generation science standards.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it seems like the market would demand that, but it's not exactly a free market in education.
That's true.
It's part of why, and I'm an advocate for school choice as a whole bunch of weeds we don't want to get into here, but
Sure.
People talk about running schools as a business, and they said it's not exactly. I mean, there's a lot of business in it, but it's
Sure.
There's some different factors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the HQIR, HQIM, depending on what state and who you're talking to, materials or resources, I think there have been some real problems with that, and we're seeing schools and teachers asking for help in sort of upscaling them in terms of being I guess aligned with good inquiry, and part of that is a coherent curriculum, and coherence is important. The knowledge revival, which was a document that I've had some of those folks on the podcast before. I mean, they really made that point that now the content in a curriculum needs to have some coherence, whether it's science or not, right?
Sure.
Okay, so
we're just to add to that, again, talking to a lot of teachers these days, and not just around the state, but even at conferences, I'm just listening to these teachers. I'm hearing more and more of them wanting to get out of the classroom and actually go into curriculum development because of this, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, this isn't working. I've been doing this for a while. This is being mandated on me. to use this particular curriculum. I need to get back and maybe try to create my own. And so
could they take those curriculum resources that you've seen if they're in a non-logical order and just reorder them?
Yeah, in fact, I've been over the summer, I've worked with some group of teachers who were struggling with a particular curriculum, and I gave them options. I said, okay, we can look at the individual science activities, and I can help you streamline those to make it more efficient, have it, follow what the scientific process, call it inquiry if you want. Or we can not only do that, but streamline, get rid of some other exercises that are in there that are more humanities-based. Or a third option, rearrange all of the lessons so they do follow a logical order. And that's what most of the time they just go for option one. So, but some of the teachers that have been using these types of curricula for a while, they end up rearranging the individual lessons, as you just said. So you're not changing you're not changing the lessons, you're just changing the order in which they're taught.
Right.
And then they're adding more because they realize that, again, the original order, it's illogical and it needs to be rearranged.
All right. So the key issue too is the conflation of science and engineering, and you've touched on it.
Yes.
But you've got 2, 4, 5 concerns here. Let's start with cognitive overload.
Sure.
Instead of learning the scientific rules behind how things work, students might end up focusing entirely on the logistics of building their project. There's several things to talk about with cognitive load, and I watched you put out a video that I saw, I think, on Twitter about novice to experts, and I assume expertise reversal effect.
Sure.
And there's some questions and tensions that I think are there we can talk about, but so it makes sense to me, right? And cognitive overload is certainly something to be aware of. It's very hard, impossible, one might say, to measure.
Yeah.
And assuming some things that may or may not be true. But I think when I read, students might end up focusing entirely on the logistics of building their project. To me, that sounds like a scaffolding problem more than anything, because we do a lot of project-based learning work, and you say, look, the first priority is learning of the content, the academic content, and whatever students are creating, if that's taking them away from that learning of the content, and you're teaching and assessing of the content and then making meaning of the content, then you've got a problem. So is it something that teachers could just better scaffold?
Before we go into that, when you say project-based learning, how do you define project-based learning? Because I've heard several definitions of that.
Right, yeah, which is, so just in a hopefully short elevator ride, a driving question that then facilitates, gives an opportunity for the teacher to model and facilitate developing a list of things you need to know, questions and things that are important to answer, which should be aligned with the content, should be your academic content standards should show up in that need to know list. And then you certainly get into the project, probably with some sort of a launch, but then you sort of phase 3, as we talk about it, is the scaffolding, explicit teaching, inquiry, collaboration, assessment, all of the things that you would want to see regardless of project-based learning.
Okay.
And so they're learning the things that they need to know, which is academic content, perhaps some other things that they need to know, and then they're demonstrating in some sort of a product. We're asking them to create something that doesn't have to be terribly sophisticated. It doesn't have to be a dog and pony show. I'm critical. I have written about, depth over dazzle, because a lot of project-based learning is dazzle, looks great on TikTok and things like that.
Sure. So I've always thought of project-based learning as an interdisciplinary activity.
Which I think is possible, but certainly not necessary.
And that's similar to engineering. So engineering is an interdisciplinary exercise. You're not pulling, you're pulling content from, or concepts, multiple concepts, possibly within a domain, or multiple domains, or even multiple disciplines. And so when you think of engineering, like here, I've got this book right here. It's this building a mousetrap race car. Okay. And there's a lot of science, physics content and mathematics involved in building a mousetrap race car. And this book is amazing if you're wanting to understand the physics and the mathematics involved in a mousetrap race car. But you also can think of it as pulling in concepts from art or history, but you're meeting some parameter. And so that moves beyond what science is to an application of knowledge. And the concerns is when you look at the next generation science standards, first of all, anytime they talk about a design or they're wanting students to do engineering, hey, I'm all for it, but they don't present it in a way where it's true engineering, where they are setting up students with the prerequisite knowledge and then using that knowledge. There's an ideation phase, right? That's the great thing about engineering. They have this base of knowledge, they're supposed to at least, and then you use this ideation phase to create something. And that's the problem with these standards, is that they don't set it up in a successful way where it's true rigorous engineering. And that's what previous critiques, especially the National Association of Scholars, they talk about this, where it's just engineering appreciation. And so that is a concern. And then you try to backload science with that, you create cognitive load where you're worried about the design of the project. Well, how does that, you're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. So, and this starts to get into the expertise reversal effect, right? And again, I think is a critique, and a valid critique of a lot of project-based learning. If you're asking students to do too much, and they don't, and you're not focusing on building the knowledge that they need to do that, right, then that's a problem. And so to me, when I think about project-based learning or just inquiry in general, that means we have to pay attention to those things here. And so your recommendation is to separate the science and engineering, right?
If you're going to, yeah, exactly. I understand the more interdisciplinary approach to that. I've come to understand what project-based learning is. I think those are great, but we often we see so many ways in which in science education and in other disciplines where we start from this integrated lens and we try to get at the content through the science content through this integrated lens. And project-based learning, again, the definition that I've read about and understood, and I could be wrong, is it's an integrated endeavor, just like engineering. It's an integrated way of going about. It's an integrated endeavor or an activity. And so if you start from engineering and you're trying to get at the rigorous content, you're really only getting at the content that applies to that project or applies to that design.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and I don't want to get into the weeds on project-based learning too much, but I agree with you. Right? I mean, there are different versions of it and the way that people talk about it. And, you talk about conflation. I think, there's a regular in sort of cognitive science of learning, a conflation of inquiry and discovery learning. And I think some of those are real problems, right? For my part, and I'm just, one small part of the project-based learning ecosystem, and quite sharply critical of people who say it should be and always is a moonshot, that kids should be discovering and learning, and you should always be interdisciplinary. To me, it's really just the process of a really good driving question, developing that need to know list, because to me, that's a really important skill to be able to develop, and teachers can model it and that kind of thing. And then you're doing the teaching, and it doesn't and shouldn't necessarily have to be something very sophisticated. But so when I have discussions, and I don't try to characterize them as arguments, but more dialectic, but
Sure.
seem to want to argue. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Slava Kalyuga's work on cognitive load theory and complex learning. So one of the things that I advocate for, and I think you have to be careful with, and I think it's applicable here. Tell me if you think it's not, but starting from a macro, with a really good question, a guiding question, a driving question, framing question, whatever that might be, which might have some analog to the sort of engineering, sort of integrated piece. I don't think it's exactly the same thing, but starting at that, asking students to think and pontificate, and I hate to use the word struggle, because people will get frustrated with that and say that's terrible, cognitive overload and all that. But to really, sort of give them an opportunity to wrestle with a little bit, not in order to solve whatever that challenge is, but to think about it and identify some of the aspects of it and maybe create a mental model. Then you go down to the micro, where you're doing the knowledge building, and then you can flower back out to something that's a bit more macro. I don't think that's a perfect analog with the sort of conflation of science and engineering, but that's kind of how I conceive of some really good inquiry teaching.
I actually argue that you would want to start with the micro level,
which is consistent with the expertise reversal effect.
Right. So you wanting to start with the basic unit, and so you're wanting to build a foundation of knowledge before, right? And you're building this foundation of knowledge through a variety of ways of knowing, one of which is the inquiry, scientific process, of course, and you're building this base of knowledge. And once this base of knowledge grows and grows and grows, it'll start to integrate with other domains, other disciplines, but you're still grounded in your area of science or history or social. You're not starting from the integrated approach. And that's so the macro level, which is what we're seeing out of certain different schools of thought. You're starting at the engineering or the project-based, or even these new curricula that are out there. They call them phenomenon-based. They start at the phenomenon level, and those are all integrated lenses. And you see the science activities time and time again, the way that they're structured, they start from the integrated approach. And it's really hard to get at the foundational content that you want your students to learn, because there's this need to have everything integrated. You've heard this probably, certain educators are like, we cannot have a siloed in education. Like they want to move away from siloed education. Well, it's not that actually the siloed education is actually really important as a foundation. It's later on is in a development of youth, is that when they start to see ways in which things are integrated, what you're talking about, the macro level, but they have to understand the foundation of knowledge at each of these areas first. Otherwise, you're going to, again, if you start at the integrated level and look down upon it, you never get to the concrete foundation of knowledge.
So I think that's there's true. I agree with much of that. And cognitive load theory and Sweller's work certainly reflects that. But again, I do think there's some evidence and certainly some people's experience, like again, Slava Kalyuga's work about complex learning, and some evidence that shows that starting with some inquiry, again, not in an effort to try to figure out the knowledge or answer the questions, but to sort of wrestle with them to sort of create a mental model and conceptual framework that I think will help in it. And I think it takes a skilled teacher, and we should be recognizing, the potential versus probability. I think that's certainly something to be cognizant of. But a skilled teacher who is able to do this, then I think when you do it starting at the macro, I don't know if integrated is the word I would use, but starting at the macro with some inquiry thought exercises to then go down to that micro, that you create more retrieval cues and actually a more connected sense of retrieval and remembering than something that might be a little bit more discrete, which not necessarily.
Here's the problem with that. Remember, inquiry, the scientific process, is an iterative process.
Mm-hmm.
And meaning it's a cycle. And if you start at the macro level, you can't have that iterative process, because you're using that knowledge towards something. You're forcing students to use knowledge towards a design or a project. And that sounds innovative, but that's not what science is. And you're forcing them to, we see this time and time again in all these new curricula. You're forcing knowledge. You're forcing knowledge towards a project. You're forcing knowledge towards engineering. That doesn't help understand this iterative process of science, because science is an iterative process where knowledge becomes more accurate and expansive. You're not using knowledge in any specific direction. In other words, science is it's not a body of authority. It's just generating knowledge. And what you do with that, well, that's subjective. When you're forcing students to use knowledge in a direction, again, we see this in all these new curricula, that crushes curiosity. That crushes skepticism. You're not allowing them to use this iterative process anymore.
So let me give you a sort of more concrete example, see if this is helpful, because I certainly see it differently.
Okay.
And I'm happy to be corrected. That's why we have these conversations. So let's say we have a driving question of something like, how can we design a test to measure the water quality in a creek or something like that.
Sure.
So what do we need to know? Well, we need to know lots of things, and
prior knowledge. Yeah.
You could certainly identify lots of things. It would be the relevant science content, right? That you would want those things to show up on the need to know list. You would know those things better than me, because wasn't a science teacher, but the triviality and the all the questions that you might be, that would be relevant and would be academically standard. That's the things you want them to learn. And then, so you've iterated that set of questions. You've given them some opportunities to kind of think about the larger problem. That's the sort of macro. And then you say, okay, so we've got these, let's say 10 things, 10 questions, 10 things that are content standards, and maybe some other things. And now you're going through that list and essentially teaching and building that knowledge as you're going.
We're making a lot of if you're talking about like designing something, we're making an assumption already that we've spent a lot of time working up to that part. Again, I don't mind, like, engineering exercises, activities are great, but we're not starting with that. We've worked our way up to that part where we're going to design something. Okay, about if I want to design an apparatus that measures the water quality of whatever, like a river or a bayou or a lake, whatever. There is, like, we're going to work our way up to that point about, well, what are ways in which we can, separation, what are ways in which strategies of separating through filtration, distillation, all of these concepts that we're talking about in chemistry. And then we get to that part. Okay, so what are possible things that are, so it's not that the engineering is a bad thing, it's just that we don't start with engineering. We work our way up to that. And you can ask any engineering professor at any major or even any institution, do you start with design on day one, or do you have them design? No, they spend a ton of time taking content classes.
Right. So those questions and one similar to the ones you mentioned, would those not work as we build this need to know list of questions and be part of that? Now, I mean, I take your point. You don't just walk in on first day of science class, generic science classes, if there is one, and say, oh, we're going to design this thing right there. But I think of learning that through the project, and you got to be careful on what the content knowledge and what those questions are, because if they're too far afield, then you do run into some problems, and that might be related to the coherence of the curriculum. But that's when I think about those questions that you mentioned. To me, those show up on the need to know list, and then give you a reason to teach them and build that knowledge in service of designing whatever apparatus or whatever.
So this is the critique of that these other documents have mentioned. It's like you're talking about a curriculum where you're focused on these individual projects. Again, these individual projects are addressing some sort of need, human need, or some sort of societal problem. When, while those might be important, but you're not, again, you're not following science content in a logical order. You're directing knowledge towards these individual projects or these societal problems, and where science could be interpreted more as, there's an agenda behind science. And the previous individual that you talked to about, oh well, there's all these societal issues, and science is turning towards that. So it's more of a what's the word that I'm looking for? More of a it's having an agenda. It's having it's more of an activist science, rather than moving towards more of an objective reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can agree to disagree. And the sort of, so I think we have to be really careful on that novice to expert move. I think that is really important, and I do see a lot of people who favor inquiry and project-based learning, these kinds of things, disregard that in ways that are important. But I also think there's a good argument and some evidence to be made for complex learning and using inquiry to start that process. But we can.
Well, I think it's more about there needs to be a foundation of knowledge, and I didn't answer your question a while back, probably about a half hour ago, when we were talking about like the importance of having knowledge, and this is a lot of what we're seeing in education time and time again, where we're putting the cart before the horse. We're putting engineering prior to science. And knowledge in and of itself will lead to more knowledge. Knowledge begets knowledge. The practice will not lead to more practices, or the practice will not lead to more knowledge. Doing an engineering activity doesn't mean that they're going to be learning content. And so or even doing a project doesn't mean that they're going to be learning the content. So they're really focused only on that. That doesn't lead to further learning. It's the rigorous understanding of the content that will lead to more knowledge.
Yeah, and I take that point. Yeah, I take that point. And I think and that's one that I try to emphasize in our project-based learning work and our inquiry work, is that the number one priority is in most academic settings, is the building of knowledge. And if you're spending, whether it's engineering or project-based learning or some inquiry fun engagement kind of activity, if that's what you're spending your time and the cognition of your students on, you're probably missing the mark, unless you're in some school that is much different from most schools, right? So a couple of the other, I mean, we're going to run out of time before we get through all the paper. So the pragmatism over truth. As a result, students can easily finish an activity successfully without ever understanding the underlying science content. I think we've kind of touched on that. The illusion of learning through proximity. And I think this is an issue, not just with inquiry or project-based learning, but there's the illusion of learning and knowledge and explicit instruction, of many whiteboards and things like that. But you're just because they're sort of around this stuff that, which to me is a scaffolding and assessment issue.
Sure.
The other two here, failure versus conceptual misconceptions. They might mistakenly believe the scientific law failed, creating deep misunderstandings about how nature works. I'm curious to hear maybe more about that. And then losing the order and cycle of science, again, which is a curriculum issue I think we've touched on. So, anything to say about those?
Again, the fact that they put science and engineering into the same dimension when they serve completely different purposes. And NGSS is such a huge proponent of using knowledge, applying knowledge. Great. I'm all for that. But using knowledge, applying knowledge is subjective. How you apply knowledge in your life that pertains to you. That's important to you. But that's different from how I apply knowledge. But it's important to have a strong base of rigorous understanding of knowledge in and of itself. And that's what the argument is that these standards and all of these things downstream of these new curricula, they don't focus on content knowledge in a rigorous manner. And I'm arguing that, hey, let's separate these two, because science and engineering they serve completely different purposes.
Yeah. And I try to emphasize that point and have that critique as well. Let's not, that's why I call it knowledge-rich inquiry, not just inquiry, right? But on the other side, I have concerns about the rigidity and sort of a narrow focus that expertise reversal effect can, and I've seen evidence that it seems like it creates. The third key issue, fragmentation of scientific practices.
Sure.
So reduced form of scientific method, question, procedure, conclusion seems reasonable. The NGSS only focuses on one practice at a time, and there's, 8 of these or something like that. Sort of unpack that a little bit more.
Sure. Like from a practical standpoint, when you look at a standard, it gives you one science practice, and they connect it to one piece of content, which they call the disciplinary core idea. But that just raises the question, how does a teacher connect this fragmented practice to the content?
Like analyzing and interpreting data, they might zero in on that.
Right. So how I train teachers, that they look at all of the practices, all the science practices together. And what we see is an elongated form of the scientific method. And so in order to connect that individual practice to the content, they're going to do one of 3 things. They're going to embed other practices naturally, because that's what inquiry is. That's what this overall scientific process or method, call it whatever you want, that will connect that will show all of what science is and connect this practice to the content. So they'll do that naturally. So why don't you just have as many practices as possible, right? Why isolate it on that way? So that's a problem. Number two, if they don't use this overall scientific process, they'll end up using direct instruction, which again is fine because at least the students are going to be learning the content. Or the worst case scenario is that they won't. They'll have some sort of practice or activity and they'll do science, but they won't connect what they've done in the activity to the actual content. And I'm seeing a lot of this where a teacher will have something and something exciting will happen, like something will move or something will change or something will explode. And the students are definitely engaged.
Right.
But you're not connecting the observation to a meaning making process. You're not reasoning, you're not forming a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a huge design flaw there, where they've fragmented the scientific method.
So let me play devil's advocate on here.
Sure.
Because I agree with you. I am not going to argue, but I'm going to play devil's advocate. So of these 8 things, they've sort of separated them out. Is there a reasonable argument that they might make? I don't know if they would make this or somebody might make this, but by separating them, fragmenting them, that's a reduction of cognitive load. That having all of these, trying to consider all of these at once might be too much.
Yeah, and that's just that's the. So I also talk about how it depends on what grade you're talking about. So if you're teaching early childhood or elementary education, we're talking about this like basic question, a process of gathering data, and you make meaning out of that. That's a innate process of how we think scientifically. And so but as we get older, as students get older, we want to scale this simple process outward. And so we do see more complicated, or I should say not complicated, complex, scientific investigations at the high school level where they're embedding a lot of those practices. But that is when you fragment them, I understand what you're saying there about a cognitive load, but we're not talking about we're talking about this overall process. So, right, the cognitive load isn't the loading working knowledge with all of these different interpretations from a variety of people or the direction of what you're trying to teach. What this overall process is in and of itself is a way of knowing. And so that it's not that you're having all of them, it's that at a bare minimum, you're having some sort of question, you have some sort of process, and you have some, gathering data, and then you have a process of making meaning out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that the students are seeing this, it's that you're training teachers to follow this scientific process. Right.
Yeah. So you've got a flawed developmental timeline, and you've got the development of science practices over time. And I think you and I are very similar in how we think about this. And I don't know that some of the other people that I've encountered critiques of NGSS, and maybe I'm wrong about you and I being on the same page on this. But again, I think about one of the things about the inquiry process and the scientific process and those things that you're mentioning is that part of the problem is they don't, the ability to understand and apply those principles don't always show up in quantitative metrics, especially early on.
Yeah.
hypothesis, without any research money to test this, is that we want to expose children from a very young age to that process and that sort of mindset. I might call it an inquiry mindset. And that part of the reason we want to do that, and I would make this pitch very strongly in the Enlightenment civics space of how do we know what's true and what's not true, and being this informed skeptic, that those skills very likely, intuitively to me, sort of crystallize over time. And and if you don't expose them to them from a young age and throughout, K-12 experience and beyond, that they certainly won't crystallize. Seems like it's sort of self-evident in some ways. But I hear from people sort of a pushback on like using inquiry at the younger ages, because boy, we should really be focused on knowledge building then. And that kind of gets to that expertise reversal effect. And I find some tension there.
Well, when do students start to reason? Like, we're starting around ages 6 or 7, right? That's what, like, they go from looking at individual images to making meaning out of their individual images, right? And so this is part of this. That's what inquiry is. You make meaning out of, you start to reason behind what you're looking at. And so when kids get really curious about things, we have parents all the time of like, oh my gosh, my son is interested in dinosaurs. I don't know how he got interested in that. Or my daughter is interested in XYZ, whatever. Great. That means that there's a question and they're observing something. Mm-hmm. Well, let's help them with this process of making meaning out of their observations. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm going back to what I said earlier about the next generation science standards have cultivated a misinterpretation of science and misinterpretation. They've created it's not inquiry, it's not science, it's a more humanities-based version of it. It's not even science. And so a lot of people who are pushing back on inquiry, they're pushing back on NGSS's interpretation of inquiry and science. They're not really pushing back on, because if they really understood that inquiry and the scientific method are the same thing, they wouldn't push back on that. So, but again, over the last 15 years now, almost 14, 15 years of NGSS influenced science and science education, that's what people are pushing back on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote, it unnecessarily delays understanding of the scientific method in an innate process of questioning, observing, and reasoning until the student is a teenager.
Right.
And,
we see that in a lot of, the state of, I heard the state of Georgia has actively telling teachers not to teach the scientific method, which is, and I hear that from certain science educators here in the state of Louisiana. Like they actively say that they don't teach the scientific method, which again is, to me, it's one of the most preposterous things I've ever heard. But there's a misinterpretation of NGSS proponents. They look upon the science education of the past as this rigid, time where students are just they're looking at a book and they're just reading and memorizing, and they're interpreting the scientific method as this rigid linear process. No, while they have these parts, right, you have some sort of initial question, you have some sort of process of gathering data, and then of course you're constructing knowledge, but you're always asking questions. You're always trying to think of ways of gathering data. You're always trying to construct knowledge. It's a cycle. And there's this misinterpretation of this iterative process.
So that resonates so strongly, again, with the Enlightenment civics kind of thing, because we should constantly be asking. And that's why I talk about this podcast being as dialectic. And like what is true? How is that true? In what ways is that true? What would make that true? What would make it untrue? And so on and so forth. That sort of inquiry mindset. But if we want students to start with like thinking about how do you start with a question and always ask questions and then investigate and do those kinds of things, how does that square with the earlier conversation we had when we were talking about the moving from the micro to the macro? Because to me, that asking a question is more like starting at a macro.
Okay. But well, what do you mean by that? How would asking a question start at a macro?
And it doesn't have to be project-based learning where you're creating something, but asking just a really big question, like, how is there the same amount of water on the earth now as there was, a billion years ago?
So we're bringing into aspects of like who we're teaching. Okay. If at the early childhood, so I work with a group of early childhood future teachers. Okay. We're all about just exploration. Like that's the key word there. Mm-hmm. It's just about like, what are you observing and getting that meaning making process down. At the elementary level, in terms of science education, there's a little bit of everything. I like to call it science a la carte. You get a little bit of biology, a little bit of,
a bit more generic science, as I mentioned before.
Like you're trying to get a little bit of everything. But as students get older, you're really trying to get back to that principle of science where content knowledge assumes an order and there's direction within that. Whereas at the earlier level, you're just getting the basics down of this process, this inquiry, But when you get older, there is direction. Like the best schools that we see at the middle school, they have a year of, it's less integration and more of, okay, we have earth space science, and then there's life sciences, and then there's physical sciences. And then when they get into high school, you are specializing. You're specializing in biology, you have chemistry, those are separate. And so there's not it's really easy to fall into this, like what we call the student-centered, teacher-centered debate on things. And I tell teachers, like, let's just take that out for a second. Like when you ask a question, there's a direction to every question that you ask. And so you want to ensure that the questions that are asking are towards the content that you want to teach. And then you build on that over and over and over, where the knowledge, again, it's following a logical order, and you're really getting into the depths and rigorous understanding of the content. So to add to what you're saying, I agree, but it also depends on who you're talking to. So you're right, if you're dealing with really early childhood and elementary, like micro, macro, it doesn't matter. It's really more of like getting into that cycle. Have some sort of curiosity, help them observe something, and then make meaning out of that. I think that's so important. And that cycle helps cultivate a classroom of curiosity. But we don't, as many teachers and educators know, it's like that cycle is broken. And I would argue that's one of the reasons, one of many reasons why curiosity kind of goes out the window by late elementary, middle school.
Well, that's fascinating, because again, a lot of that resonates, and I will be curious if anybody who's listening, and I hope people who are, I know, at least my perception, maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to hear from them who are critical of NGSS and at least my stance on inquiry. They, I think, would push back on what you characterized in the early ages. So I'd be curious to hear about them.
Sure.
And the way that you characterized it, I think is at least largely consistent with how I think about inquiry. Not necessarily project-based learning. That's a bit different, right? It gets a little bit more analogous to engineering. The key issue number 4, I think we've touched on enough. Reliance on thematic lenses that undermine deep content mastery. Lots on the the expertise and novices and things that we've touched on, and people can read this thing. They don't even have to just listen to us. So if they're still listening at this point, key issue number 5, and I think this is the last one, right? Vague descriptions and disordered sequencing of science content. And I guess say more about that one.
Sure. When you look at again, previous critiques have talked about the lack of content, and we hear from NGSS proponents that, oh, well, these are just a rough outline. Well, the problem is that if you're not explicitly listing the content, well, then you're left with teachers not really knowing what to teach. And furthermore, you have curriculum developers that aren't really, they don't have much guidance. And so what I have said is like the standard floor turns into the classroom ceiling. Is like people aren't really going above and beyond what is listed there. And that's really unfortunate. But furthermore, like when you really look at the content, and there's a pattern there where you have the science being merged with engineering, which leads to more of a consensus-based education. You have themes that are these cross-cutting concept themes that are used where content is presented more at a thematic level. And then you have the content in and of itself is vaguely described. That leads to more of a language-based education, where I understand that language is it could be a mode of accessing content, but the problem is that you need to get into the rigorous content, the mathematics, the definitions, and when you get into the details, that's when the language-based science education goes away and you're really getting into the details of the mathematics. So that's the argument and the pattern that we see in these standards.
Okay, so some of the recommendations and conclusions. You've got an overview of a new scientific knowledge model.
Sure.
I'm looking at it here. So you've put in the context of biology, chemistry, physics. If I'm understanding it correctly, sort of 3 phases: constructing scientific knowledge, reinforcing scientific knowledge, and then utilizing scientific knowledge. Yeah,
and that's, again, one of the great things about the next generation science standards is that they had a model. Okay, like this is the first time that science standards had a model, a template, and there's something very persuasive about that. If you've been in science education a while, you know that NGSS and their 3D learning has been marketed over and over, and that hey, from a business perspective, kudos to them, but what I think any new science standards are going to have a new model. Like they're going to have a model in and of itself. And it's probably one of the critiques I do have of the Franklin standards, where I think they're great. I think they're content enriched, but there needs to be a model that goes along with that, which was great for presentation. And so when you think about science or any discipline, how do you construct knowledge? Well, we construct knowledge scientifically and, through this inquiry cycle, if you want to call it that, and then we're going to reinforce it. And this goes into a lot of I think I'm excited of what we're seeing in science education, where you can't just have working knowledge, you have to reinforce it. You have to, because you got to go from working knowledge to long-term knowledge. And so you want to use these exercises to reinforce it. So you're developing long-term memory and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And then you want to use it somehow, and you can connect it to associated knowledge or use it through application. And this is where, and I know I didn't say that earlier in the video, but I'm not about eliminating any part of the dimensions of the next generation science standards. I'm actually wanting to rearrange them so that if you're wanting to apply knowledge, whether it's in to understand something in the real world or through engineering, or even understanding what these themes are, or even to yourself and your own, or even applying it to what a lot of educators call, higher ordered thinking through these like higher level Bloom's taxonomy questions, like levels 3 and up. Sure, let's get into those, but let's set up students successfully by having them master the content first, and then start to use this knowledge in these variety of different ways. And that's how I organize science education through these three parts.
Yeah. I don't know, you may not be familiar with the work of Christian Moore Anderson. He's a biology teacher in Spain.
Okay.
He's been on the podcast. He's written about a book. I'd be curious to hear your reactions to it. But, one of the things that he mentions, and I think that's relevant here, is the issue of you've mentioned meaning making quite a bit. And one of my concerns about the sort of science of learning is it is so focused on knowledge building, which again, I think is really important and something that we've overlooked in education. I think the progressive end of the spectrum, Howard Gardner, owned up to that when I talked with him last. And so I do think that's a missing piece, but there's such a focus on knowledge building. And I think sometimes in a sort of discrete way, and the sort of idea that we can just sort of tell them and explain the knowledge, and we do that, and then maybe we can go apply. I'm not sure that always happens, but as he says, like, meaning can't be transmitted. Like, learners have to work with that, have to think about that, which is why I often distinguish, and I think it's a distinction that makes a difference, is thinking and learning. Getting things from short-term memory to long-term memory. And I think you use the term associated knowledge. I've not heard it that way, but, connected knowledge, tissue that is in between them, not just sort of learning things. And so that's why I think the inquiry process, starting with that question and maybe a bit more macro, can help create some of that connective tissue and make that the long-term knowledge a bit more connective and create additional retrieval cues. But that's my pitch.
Yeah, you're again, when you can apply knowledge and I can apply knowledge in a variety of different ways. And that's really important to show students how, like, they can apply knowledge. But if that shouldn't be the focus, because we should have examples, but how you use knowledge is none of my business. And right? At least that's my view of it. But we should allow. We should show students how they can use knowledge. But again, that's subjectivity, and I'm against standardizing subjectivity. So I think it's important to. I don't think you can overemphasize learning content knowledge in the rigorous manner, because I view applying knowledge as almost natural. The more content that they'll know, then it's almost a natural process where they'll start to ask questions on their own. And I see that in even my methods classes, where we focus on content knowledge and the teaching of it. And my future teachers will immediately start asking, well, does that have to do with this? And that initial little question of theirs is just a little bit of curiosity that they have, which is what you want to cultivate in your own classroom. And
well, and maybe that's at least a small point of disagreement between us, because I think that obviously can happen. But there are ways to optimize for that, and I have some concerns that some teachers think that if you teach the knowledge, that the students will automatically inquire and be curious. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. But on the other side of that, if we're not teaching the knowledge, then they will struggle to inquire about much at all. So, that's why I say it's sort of yes and.
This is going to a little story. Like I had a student who, when I was teaching in Chicago, it was my second year teaching, and he said to me, he's like, I'm not sure if I like biology. And I said, well, I'm not expecting you to like every single discipline, right? But I'm expecting you to understand the content. And so I think the expectation that every student that is going to come into your classroom is going to like biology or like chemistry. I think that is, certainly you can have engagement, of course. Mm-hmm. Yes, mm-hmm. I'm all for that. But in order for them to have a preference for that, I think that's an expectation I'm not sure we should have. But again, I would for another conversation.
I wouldn't disagree with that. No, and I am. I try to distinguish between behavioral engagement or something like emotional engagement, and making sure that we're more interested in cognitive or intellectual or academic engagement, because that's a trap that sort of progressive kids are having fun, they're interested, they're excited.
Yeah.
Okay, but are they learning the things we want them to learn?
Exactly.
Right.
We're not entertainers. We can be engaging, but we're not clowns.
Right. You might be entertaining. You might have fun. It's not a bad thing.
Sure.
But that shouldn't be your number one priority. Right. Yeah. Well, for those savages who are still listening to us go on about this wonkery, is there anything that we didn't talk about that we should, and anything that you want to mention as far as where they should find your work and all that good stuff?
No, this has been a great conversation. Thank you. I do have to run here. I do have a class here in a moment. So, but this is good timing. But thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Okay. I can get website links and social media stuff for you. We'll put that in the show notes,
sure.
And we'll go from there. But thanks for doing this. I appreciate the conversation. It was fun for me too. So thanks, Nathan.
Okay.